Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of our podcast. We welcome our listeners to the We Are Strong podcast. This podcast was created by Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Center, and our goal is to increase and provide awareness in human trafficking of Indigenous persons. We aim to do this by developing this podcast with in-depth conversations, prevention, continuing support, information, sharing resources, and speakers to our communities, friends, and families. We hope that this will guide them in being aware and safely addressing the broad spectrum of human trafficking issues related to the impact of our community. Today we have Suzanne joining us. But first, my name is Mason Dabosky. I am the Ember's Cultural Leadership Coordinator at Toronto Council Fire. And Farah will introduce herself.
Thank you, Mason. Hi, everybody. My name is Farah Talat. I am the Youth Wellness Navigator here at Toronto Council Fire Native Culture Center. And like Mason said, I am one of the co-hosts for today's podcast. And what about you, Suzanne? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. Bonjour, Nia Nadeshnakosh, Ganukwe, Mukwadodem, Alderville Donchaba. Always speaking in the sovereign language to introduce myself. I'm from Williams Treaty. My English name is Suzanne Smoke. My spirit name is Ganukwe, Golden Eagle Woman. I sit with the Bear Clan, and I work with Muskoka Perry Sound Sexual Assault Services. I do Indigenous outreach and human trafficking, and I also work with Taboo Mental Wellness. And I'm just filling in gaps and supports during COVID, all the increased crisis and trauma work that's happening because of COVID.
Suzanne, how did you initially get involved with the MMIW G2S movement?
Well, it directly affected my family. Back in 1992, we lost my young cousin, Patricia Carpenter, and Joyce, my cousin, who's lived in Toronto for many, many years. This was long before the MMIW tagline that we lost my little cousin, and that's always really stuck with me and, always left that hole in my heart. And I always was reaching out to Joyce and just seeing her find her voice over the years to be able to speak to that trauma. I can't imagine as a mother what she's gone through, but just knowing that, this is one of our young women from Alderville First Nation. And, we want to always remember her and honor Joyce's path walking that she is now without her daughter and that work that needs to be done. So that was the starting point, I guess, for me, why it's really in my heart. But also just seeing so many other young people. I was in the streets of Toronto as a young girl, like in my teen years into my 20s. And when I moved away from my community and came to the city, I thought, everything's all bells and whistles and sparkly and everything's great. But really understanding that inner city, you can fall through the cracks very, very quickly, and especially as Indigenous women, knowing that we're targeted, that we're pinpointed, we're hunted. And the repercussions for a perpetrator against an Indigenous woman is a lot less, if it's even investigated. Many cases are unfounded. So that had a direct impact as well, just really understanding the precarious vulnerability of Indigenous women when they leave from their communities and go to inner cities. That was huge for me, seeing those challenges and obstacles and barriers.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to that about the way that your different parts of your identities intersect and the systems of oppression that have affected your life and the life of your little cousin. And thank you for bringing her up and for keeping her memory alive. So I know you are president and your daughter is vice president of the Southern Ontario AIM. So in what ways do you feel that the driving force of the AIM movement intersects with the MMIW G2S movement?
So Cedar and I have been involved with the American Indian movement, I would say approximately 15 years in activism, our roles in the blockades and Idle No More and all of those things. The American Indian movement has made great changes in the last few years, and we have two co-directors. The old guard, I'll say, Clyde Belcourt is, I believe, the only founding member that's still alive. Very much elderly, has some health issues, and we always want to protect Clyde and keeping him safe right now from COVID and all of that. But at that time, he also stepped down and gave the role to a woman to lead the movement. Lisa Bellinger, she's my Sundance sister. I have worked with her over the years, and she works in education. She works in language. Very powerful, strong Kwe, part of the Meday Lodge. And all of the other founders of AIM have also passed on. Eddie Benton-Benai, Dennis Banks, Russell Means, these were the ones that paved the way back in the 70s. And in the 70s, there was a lot of stuff, a lot of ego, a lot of press. AIM was considered I guess, one of the most, not terrorist organizations, but one of the biggest threats to the federal government at that time. And they addressed stopping violence against Indigenous people. So I think that after 1970, as we progress through the American Indian movement, really understanding that the voice of women really need to come to the forefront. And while I've been sundancing and in ceremony with the Gathering of Sacred Pipes hosted by the American Indian movement for the last 9 years, the voice of the women has been elevated, and there's women taking leadership roles. And there was always women in leadership, but just not having that vocal public figure place. But women are the driving force and always have been. And, you know, there's some really powerful, wonderful women in the movement. And also telling the men that they need to be our protectors. They need to stand at our sides, and they need to let us do the work, whether it's protecting the water, protecting the women, raising voices around that. And the men have been taking that role and taken that step back and said, yes, it's time for the women to lead. So that's what I think is really, really important, that change is happening within the movement itself. People say, you know, American Indian movement, and you're sitting in Canada. And I'm like, but that's a colonial structure. That border crossed us. There is no border for me. I travel freely across Turtle Island. That's a colonial border that's imaginary, that does not have an impact on me. So we are the American Indian Movement, Southern Ontario chapter. And for me, I also want to call out that thug culture, that warrior culture. You know, to be a warrior means to protect the people. To be a warrior means to protect the women. And, you know, I've stressed to people wanting to join the American Indian movement, if you're thug life and leather jackets and throwing gang signs and talking about, you know, bros and stuff like that, this isn't the movement for you then, because we're about protecting our women. We are about elevating the voice of our sacred women. You know, we are the protectors. We are the leaders. We're going to lead the way for the men. And that's what this is about. In our board for the American Indian Movement, we have trans, we have Two-Spirit. My daughter Cedar is vice president. She's also been sundancing and working with the American Indian Movement also for the last 9 years. So very much her formative years growing up as a young woman, and really about honoring herself, honoring the walk that she takes, and really understanding the dangers that are involved for young Indigenous women in inner city.
It sounds amazing, Suzanne. You guys definitely do great work. Are there any challenges that you may have come across in addressing human trafficking?
Yes, for me, my role for the last 3 years with Muskoka Parry Sound Sexual Assault Services was really sifting through the stuff that happens within the agencies that are non-Indigenous, who are there to serve Indigenous people. We know that there's bias. We know that there's stereotypical racism. We know there's all kinds of things that are happening in healthcare. And so for me, it's about educating and calling out some of those behaviors within the agencies. You know, there's two-tiered level of service for Indigenous women and for non-Indigenous women, and that needs to stop. And people are very comfortable with that status quo, that we are less than, that we are not as valued. And we've been dehumanized for so long, for 500 years, since the fur trade, since Pocahontas, since mascots, all of those things, that Canadians have also been taught the same thing, that we are less than. And so for me, I educate these agencies. I work with them. We do training. Today, there's a Bemikaway training that's going on with one of the agencies we work with, and just really being a conduit to educating them, calling them out on bias. You know, we know what's happening. They struggle with that and say, oh, but we're not racist, but really the whole system of oppression is racist, and not calling out individual people, but really breaking down that whole construct of that oppressive Western lens of healing us. I tell all of the agencies that they need to include elders, they need to include survivors, they need to include knowledge keepers, pipe carriers in their healing methods. So that's really, really important. I've been working with Canadian Mental Health Association, the ECHO program, Shkabe Makwa, which is addictions counselors, doctors, social workers working with pipe carriers, medicine people, lodge keepers. And we can diagnose clients and work together and give them both Western and traditional diagnosis. So someone may get medication for PTSD, trauma, but we're also giving them a cedar bath and a grieving ceremony, or, you know, even a connecting ceremony of giving them their name, their colors. All of those things, we have to incorporate both Western and traditional into our healing methods and practices. And MPSS has been really supportive of allowing me to, we're coordinating. We were just going to actually have a sweat when COVID hit, so we stopped that. But for a service agency in sexual assault to be able to incorporate sweat lodge, cedar baths, because we know that those cedar baths clear that trauma. So allowing us to integrate that, our agency is really progressive, very aware of gender neutral. We do training in trans, supporting trans. We now have a male survivor program, and that was really coming about because I know that there's many males within our communities that also suffer from sexual assault and trauma. I believe it's 1 in 3 females, 1 in 6 males. So that's a high number, especially in our Indigenous community, and there is not many services for men. So in the 3 years that I've been there, and it's not just specifically me, but so now we have a men's program. We've done trans inclusivity training so that if someone's looking for sexual assault services, there are not barriers for them. We want to make sure that anybody that's seeking services has services. So that's been really, really key, is educating and working with non-Indigenous agencies, making sure that they have Indigenous knowledge keepers in their toolbox of resources to help our communities.
Wow, that was really beautiful. Hearing all the ways that you engage in healing with the survivors, both men and women and non-binary people, is very inspiring.
While we're on the topic, what are some ways that you combat human trafficking and violence against women in your daily life?
So every day, I reach out to different youth. I reach out to our community. I'm always volunteering in the community, making sure that my voice and my face is out there. There's a lot of word of mouth out on the streets. For the most part, I try and support victims in accessing services, housing, funding, supports. Also, I'm not a survivor and I can't speak to that experience. I refer people to other survivors that are working in this field. What I try and do is eliminate the barriers and the obstacles for them seeking services. You know, there's so many layers of trauma that happens with a sexual assault survivor that many sexual assault agencies, you know, like a domestic violence shelter, really doesn't fit the needs of a traffic survivor, and really understanding that there's challenges and differences. So just, you know, working with women, removing those obstacles and connecting them with the right agency that's a good fit for them, that's actually culturally safe and culturally appropriate for them. And also just working with our youth and telling our young women how magnificent we are, that we are valued, that we are sacred beings, that we carry water, we carry life. Creator gave us the role of creation. We're magnificent as Indigenous women, and we need to think of ourselves as such. And, you know, when we go into our life with that mindset, you know, I think that human traffickers look for vulnerable, they look for broken, they look for trauma, they target those that they deem weak. And, you know, when we carry ourselves in a good way, when we walk with that magnificence that Creator gave us, that role of creation, we have a piece of our spirit. And so just really about that self-awareness, raising our own value as Indigenous women. We aren't all victims. We are survivors, and we are the most strongest, resilient women across Turtle Island. So yeah, I just try and reiterate that and tell our young women how magnificent they are every day.
Wow, I love hearing you speak about women, especially Indigenous women. I feel like you're such an inspiration to your community and to young women and women all over the world. That is just so beautiful to hear you speak like that. And you're right, you're so right. And you also spoke towards advocacy groups and organizations that are culturally safe and appropriate for Indigenous women. So can you tell us a little bit more and maybe explain the work that you do at the Muskoka Women's Advocacy Group?
Yes, so we do one-on-one counseling. We have a SAIL program, which is Sexual Assault Integrated Living, which is like a 16-week program. Those run daily. We do a SAIL 1 to 4, so there's different levels of healing that happens within that. I also sit on the Muskoka Simcoe County Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition, so that's all the stakeholders that come to the table in mental health, social services, housing, sexual assault, healthcare, and we try and provide wraparound services and try and really educate people around that. And even in the beginning of that, really understanding the work that needed to happen, because when an Indigenous woman presented at an emergency room saying she's been trafficked, their response was, call the local friendship center. And I'm like, no, she needs all of these services and supports just because she's Indigenous, there's people that, you know, we have kids that are volunteering their time after school that answer a phone at a friendship center. They're not equipped to deal with the trauma of a human traffic survivor. Just because we're Indigenous doesn't mean that we only get Indigenous people to serve us. And so getting their mindset around that yes, we have access to police, justice, victim services, VWAP, all of those VAW agencies, violence against women agencies, really need to, again, look at that two-tiered level of service. So we've identified those obstacles in how they lay out our floor plan, I guess, for when we have a victim or survivor approach us. And we go from the premise of, in the first hour, what does she need and what are those supports? Does she need safety? Does she need healthcare? Does she need a hospital? And we work that through to the next 24 hours and the next week and the next 2 weeks, and then long term. So what are those wraparound supports, and really engaging with the community and really putting value to Indigenous women seeking those services. So that's the work I do within Simcoe County with the coalition. I've also had the opportunity to work with the United States Embassy in Toronto in anti-human trafficking. And working to stem the tide of violence in Minnesota, because we know a lot of our girls are going through the lakes, through the Great Lakes. They're transferring them from Thunder Bay, and they're ending up in like Duluth, Minnesota, other places. We had a couple of young girls that had fled from the East Coast, ended up in down south near Alabama, and I called AIM. I called some brothers that I knew, and I said, we have 2 young girls, and I guess they were assaulted at an agency they went to for support. And so they were fleeing and they didn't know where to go. So I called in some of my brothers and said, you know, we have these 2 young girls, we're trying to repatriate them back home. There are funding sources in place for human traffic victims, but I don't think a lot of the victims are aware, and they don't have access. They can't pick up a phone and dial a 1-800 number. They don't have the time to go through all the advocacy groups. So how can we make this clear, quick, and concise for survivors and victims, and make sure that we have that we're making our supports accessible to them?
Suzanne, as a male and a youth worker in the community, what are ways that I can do to teach the youth so that they become more knowledgeable about the MMIW G2S movement? Also, what is something that we can do every day to just become better protectors?
So the buddy system, sister up, brother up, that's what we say now. You know, we don't go out alone. If we're going to go out, putting ourselves in vulnerable positions, if people are using, drinking, whatever they're doing, that we buddy up. We don't ever leave anybody behind. If, you know, we don't allow people to leave with somebody from a party. We don't just take off if somebody's really too drunk or under the influence and not in their right faculties, then we don't leave them. We bring them home. If someone's a little bit too intoxicated, then we make sure that they're safe and we get them home. Those are the small things that we can do. And really understanding that for human traffic survivors, addictions is a big part of it because it's a forced addiction. So even trying to break free from that, we have to have those supports in place. So just being very aware. We use harm reduction methods within the work that we do. We know that people struggle, and especially from that colonial trauma, everybody deserves services, no matter what state they're in. You know, I don't care if someone's using, I don't care if someone's drinking, they still deserve supports. They still deserve that kindness. They still deserve to be able to be cared for. So yeah, it's about, you know, that personal ownership of looking after ourselves and the people around us. But in the broader community, really raising awareness, repatriation of our survivors back to their communities. There is a lot of lateral violence in our communities, a lot of gossip, a lot of people talk about other people. Oh, did you hear she did this? Things like that. And we really can't have that, where there's no room for this right now. And when our people are struggling and when they're really hurting, we don't know the story. We don't know everybody's full story. And we have to be kind and gentle in how we work with everyone. And that's, you know, I just say sister up, time to brother up. You know, we need our Ogitata standing at our sides while we do the work. And that's what I think is really key for community.
Yes, definitely. I think you spoke a lot towards, I guess, the individual aspect of it, but also more so the community and also structural aspect of it. And I think that's really important too, because like you mentioned before, it is multi-layered, and the violence against women, especially Indigenous women, is multi-layered. So do you have any numbers on the women missing within Canada and the US?
So I would just say that the numbers are exponentially higher right now, and especially during COVID. And also what's happening during COVID is a lot of it has gone underground, and that there isn't as much reporting as there was before. But our crisis lines are going through the roof. Our service delivery is running at double capacity than what it was prior. In the States, we know that the numbers are huge. There was a database that was created back in 2011 through some MMIW advocates. And at that time, they had over 4,200 names on that list of MMIW. We believe that that number is exponentially higher because we know in the field that only 10% report. So there's 90% that haven't reported. So if her numbers are at 4,200, we believe they're exponentially higher at possibly 15,000 Indigenous women that have gone missing in this country. And that's way too many. And so that was really one of the main reasons why I wanted to get into this work. Something is really broken with this system, and for a country that thinks there are caretakers, that thinks that they know better for us than what we do, they're failing miserably because we're scraping the bottom of the barrel for services. We're begging for crumbs, and we're the highest rate of incarceration, highest rate of violence, highest rate of dropout, highest rate of sexual assault. Our numbers are through the roof. So somebody dropped the ball, and we as the Indigenous community can't rely on anyone else to do this work for us. We have to take on that role and responsibility, and that's why I do it.
Wow, that's crazy that only 10% are being reported. How does the cultural help in the struggle with MMIW G2S? Is there a sense of lost identity for these women?
I think there's a sense of lost identity for many within the Indigenous community, whether they're trafficked or not. I think the colonial trauma, the disconnect between family structures, the whole very controlled assimilation efforts of breaking down our family dynamic through the residential schools, through all of that, has really disconnected our families and broken that circle. And so for me, I think that the key to survivors is culture and ceremony and repatriation back to community. And for the young ones that are looking for that better life, that are coming from a place of trauma, ceremony is key, not the inner cities, not going to find and change locations. It's about ceremony, and it's about self and self-awareness. We are magnificent beings. Creator gave us the role as Anishinaabe people to be caretakers of the earth. But we're disappearing at an alarming rate. So we have to take control in our communities. We have to take control in our own families and ourselves. We have to attend those ceremonies. We have to reach out to the elders and the knowledge keepers, and really understanding with that broken system, who are those people now? And making sure that the people that are involved in those healing are also culturally safe and culturally appropriate, and not trauma and victims and survivors themselves. There's many unhealthy people working in community that haven't dealt with their stuff either. So for me, I always tell people, seek out your elders, know who they are, and never go to a healer or approach someone alone. Again, in our communities, we're suffering from trauma. We're suffering from sexual abuse from residential schools. Those traumas didn't just go away when people left from residential school. They brought those traumas into our communities. And it's really, really difficult, and people don't want to talk about it, because those are our aunties, our uncles, our brothers, our sisters, our grandmas, our grandpas. And that trauma came into our communities. So it's really difficult to address it. It's really difficult to talk about it. But if we don't address it, there's a problem, we can't fix it. And so, some of the young people that are fleeing from their communities, what can we put in place so that they're safe? What can we provide for them? And I think that the younger generation is so aware. I have such great hope for our communities, because our young people are aware, and they're learning, and they're educating themselves in both Western and traditional knowledge. But for me, ceremony is key. Ceremony has saved my life, and it saved the lives of my daughter, my family. And I can't stress it enough that ceremony is key. It's who we are. It's in our identity. It's in our genes.
Yes, for sure. And I think, speaking of young people, Cedar is another trailblazer in the community. She is just a wonderful, amazing, beautiful, kind, smart person. I'm very happy to know her, and I see you all over her social media as well all the time. So it kind of feels like I know you, but not really. But was there anything that you had to actively practice or keep in mind when you were raising your daughter, knowing the knowledge that you hold about human trafficking?
So for me, I mean, I'm Mama Bear. Everybody in community knows I'm Mama Bear. You know, don't hurt my girl. But also just also being aware that I'm oversensitized to the violence against women, and really didn't want to be scaring her as she was growing up. But I wanted her to be aware, and being really aware of her surroundings, being really aware that, you know, if she's going out with her girlfriends to a party somewhere, you know, as teenagers do, that it's not her circle of friends that I'm worried about. It's the older people or somebody that's a stranger coming into that setting and looking around and seeing one young Indigenous girl and she's sitting with 4 or 5 blonde, blue-eyed girlfriends. Most likely she'll be the target of some type of violence more so than them. And just raising her with that awareness that she's 12 times more likely to become a victim than her beautiful blonde, blue-eyed girlfriends. And, you know, it's a sad statement, but it's our reality. So just really teaching her about being aware, being safe. You know, I really stress to her about substance use and substance abuse. We've never had alcohol in our home. It's just not my way. But sadly, Cedar's heard me called an alcoholic hundreds of times in her life because of the bias in healthcare and different things, but really understanding the stigma that's attached to that when we pick up alcohol, when we pick up those things. And those are her choices. I'll love her no matter what choices that she'll make. Our door's always open, and we have a very open relationship, very kind relationship. We're very close. You know, we tell each other we love each other every day. We sometimes fight like cats and dogs. You know, I watched that young, beautiful little girl grow up to be a vibrant, strong, wonderful Ogichitokwe. So there's times where we butted heads, but we know that we always love each other. We always have each other back, each other's backs. And no matter what happens in our life, she knows that I'm there for her. And it doesn't matter where I am across Turtle Island, I'll always be there for her. And I think that's key too for young people, is that they need to have a support in place. They need to have that connection. And so I'm aunties to many of the young people within the community call me auntie, and I try and walk that way in a good way. I'm a helper. Am I part of the problem, or am I part of the solution? And Cedar's grown up with that her whole life too. You know, when COVID hit, she's like, Mom, we have to do something. You know, when it's land back, she's out there front and center. When it's housing and somebody's struggling, then we go make sure that they have furniture. We get them moved in. We do whatever we need to do in community to be a helper. And that's Cedar's role. You know, my highlight of raising my daughter, she dances out as a white buffalo catwoman in the Sundance, and you know, there's no pictures, there's no, you know, we can't record anything, but it's the most sacred time for her to walk out carrying that beautiful buffalo pipe and have the buffalo dancers surround her. And they're healing the people, they're healing those that are suffering from addictions, those that have suffered from suicide. It's a tremendous, wonderful ceremony, and I'm just so overwhelmed and brought to tears every time I see her dance out. And I put culture in front of her from before she was born. She was born into ceremony. We did water ceremony. Her placenta went out to the water. Her whole life is ceremony. You know, one of the first berry fasts that she brought back to her community. It's ceremony and culture is key for our survival and for our identity. And Cedar has had culture throughout her whole life. There's never been question of who she is and where she comes from.
Wow. I mean, I feel like you've spoken so much towards Cedar's life, your relationship with Cedar, and your role within community. And I'm just kind of wondering, how do you take care of your own mental health and well-being in your line of work?
So I have a lodge right here in my backyard. We have a sacred fire. A lot of time people come with us with Selma and tobacco, and Cedar and I are both pipe carriers. Many years ago, I was gifted a pipe. And I asked, where did this come from? Who are my helpers? And they said that this pipe came from Pipestone, Minnesota, that there's a quarry there that's only 3 quarrying tribes have access to. And 90% of the pipes all around Turtle Island come from this Pipestone quarry. So I wanted to go there. I needed to go there and meet the carver, see the stone, you know, Nadoasin. That's her dad's name, actually, Nadoasin, spirit of the stone. And so for me, I needed to connect to that stone. And when we arrived in Pipestone, it was the AIM Gathering of Sacred Pipe Sundance, over 150 pipe carriers. And so we've been involved with that now for many, many years. This is our 9th year. I'm dancing my 4th year this year. It's my giveaway, which is just tremendous for me. I've been saving items and gathering items for 4 years because I'm a sun dancer every day. I'm not just a sun dancer for those 10 days. I'm a sun dancer every day. And I try and live this good life. And ceremony has saved my life, and I know that it's given Cedar her path and her direction in life. I try and travel 4 times a year to get down to Pipestone to the quarry. I gift my quarrymen. I just actually went and bought him a wedge for stone. Like, it's just, it's every day. We're connected to that stone. So we have our lodge in the back. We have a teepee in the back. We hold full moon ceremony. Our Sundance is our greatest gift that we can do with each other. So we're so looking forward to going and preparing the grounds, and 10 days in ceremony feeds my spirit for the 354 days that I'm home doing the crisis work. And those 10 days I hold in my heart throughout the whole year, and Cedar too. And this is our connection together as mother and daughter. And I even said, as we grow older and she moves on in her life, maybe gets married and has her own children, and I settle and do whatever I'm doing somewhere, if it's not in this region, we know that every quarter, every 3 months, every year, we're going to meet in Sundance. And that's a beautiful connection to have as mother and daughter. Yeah, she feeds my spirit, and ceremony feeds our spirit together.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I was going to say, it sounds like your culture is a big part of your life, but then I'm understanding that culture is your life, your culture, and it is your being. And to hear you express this is just so beautiful. And to also see that the ways that you're integrating your life and your being and your culture with the work that you do and the ways that you support other women and people in the community. I mean, I just have to say thank you so much. Like, I'm sure we are also honored to have you here and to have had you join us. You're a driving force in the community, and you're a strong and honorable role model for your daughter, but for everybody else too. And I just want to thank you again for joining us today.
I want to say thank you too. Like, this was amazing. You're so knowledgeable in what you do. I'm going to take everything from this podcast and what I've learned today, and just even like give back to the community. Thank you so much.
Chimigwach for having me, and just reiterating, I'm just a human being. I'm just a simple woman raising my daughter alone, and we have work to do in our communities. We all have to reach out. We have to sister up. We have to brother up and protect each other, and that's just our role. We're part of the solution. So Chimigwach, and tremendous work from Council Fire as well. They were a driving force in my life when I was in my 20s back in Toronto and struggling alone, and they were a driving force as well. So Chimigwach to all of the leadership at Council Fire. Miigwech.
Thank you again, Suzanne, for those incredible words, and a huge thank you to all of our listeners. Make sure you tune in to the next episode of We Are Strong. Mama P.